Okay, everyone, I think we're ready to get started here. First off, I want to thank everybody for joining us for what should be an info-filled discussion about compliance in the social world. For background, my name is Molly Yakubian. I'm an Assistant Vice President of Compliance in Cordium's Boston office. In addition to providing compliance consulting services to clients, I also manage Cordium's Electronic Communications Review Team, which is responsible for conducting the electronic communications reviews for Cordium clients. In that capacity, I have pretty strong exposure to varying electronic communications policies and procedures, as well as to the communications of advisors themselves. Hopefully this experience will enable me to share with you some expertise on the subject. Also, joining me today is Chantel D'Angelo. Chantel is a compliance associate. Chantel also works with me in Cordium's Boston office and is a member of the Electronic Communications Review Team. Chantel will be assisting me today with polling questions and questions from the audience. To that effect, to the extent you have any questions as I go along here, please utilize the questions feature of the GoToWebinar dashboard, which you should see on the right-hand side of your screens. We have carved out time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. With that, let's get started. In today's session, we're going to discuss electronic communications compliance. Specifically, we'll talk about the evolution of the regulatory landscape and notable enforcements and exam deficiencies we've been seeing in the area. We'll then take a hard look at the SEC exam requests that went out back in June, focused on non-firm email electronic communications. I'll provide an overview of what we saw requested and discuss what we think are the implications of these exams. Next, we'll talk about what to expect in routine SEC examinations from an electronic communication standpoint. We'll talk about typical requests, how to respond, and some helpful practice tips so that you're examination ready. Next, we'll discuss developing and implementing policies and procedures, including what we consider to be suitable oversight in electronic communications surveillance process. We'll do a deep dive into the use of electronic communications surveillance specifically to MNPI testing. And lastly, we'll wrap it up with some helpful tips and thoughts going forward in the electronic communications regulatory landscape. Before we dive into the first section, we're actually just going to open it up with a poll for the group.
For our first poll, we're asking everybody, what type of strategy does your firm pursue? Hedge fund, private equity, fund of funds, venture capital, or other? All right, we're going to wrap up the poll now. Thank you for all your responses. It looks like we have a 33% hedge funds, 21% private equity, 11% fund of funds, and 28% other.
Thanks, Chantel. So that's good, pretty healthy mix. I think for those of you in that larger group of the, in the hedge fund group there, pay special attention to the section when we focus on the electronic communications and MNPI. We should have some good pointers for you there. All right. So we're going to begin with an overview of electronic communications compliance. Title of the presentation today is Compliance in the Social World. It certainly is social and increasingly so. Text messaging is now the most used data service in the world. Studies show that the number of monthly texts sent increased more than 7,700% over the last decade. WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger alone combine for more than 60 billion messages sent every day. Millennials, who are among the most prominently represented generation in the workforce today, utilize electronic communications. I think there is an actual aversion to having a live phone call, it would seem. So we're left with emails, text messaging, social media messaging, and third-party app messaging. Here lies the future of workplace communication overall. But what does that mean for advisors? One can argue that by not allowing employees to utilize multiple forms of electronic communications, firms might be doing themselves a disservice. Not only that, but blanket prohibitions on electronic communications, which is what many advisors have had historically, likely just aren't working. Texting and messaging is now the norm. So it's doubtful that those types of communications aren't being utilized by your employees in some capacity. So where does that leave a CCO? Communications related to an advisor's business are likely required records and must be maintained. archived and retained pursuant to the books and records rule. The challenge then lies in applying old regulatory statutes and laws to a relatively new and booming phenomenon of electronic communications. So let's first take a look at where regulators have stood on the topic in the recent past. Back in January 2011, the SEC actually conducted a sweep exam focused on advisor use of social media. And 1 year after those sweep exams, the SEC released a national examination risk alert focused on investment advisor use of social media. Now, in that risk alert, SEC said RIAs should consider reviewing their document retention policies to ensure that any required records generated by social media communications are retained in compliance with federal securities laws, and that they need to be kept in a manner that allows the records to be arranged and indexed. SEC further went on to say that firms should be considering whether current retention policies account for the unique communication channels available to each particular social media site, and encourage advisors to adopt policies and procedures. So that was kind of the first time that we saw some real guidance around kind of the expanding breadth of electronic communications that are being used by advisors. In January of last year, so 1 year ago, FINRA's 2017 priorities letter explicitly focused on social media and other electronic communications. Now, while I feel that most of the audience here are registered investment advisors, oftentimes we've seen SEC rules kind of follow FINRA guidance. So it's helpful to see that, not just the SEC, but the other regulators are focused on this as well. Now, in that January 2017 priorities letter, FINRA said that they'll be reviewing firms' compliance with their supervisory and record retention obligations with respect to social media and other electronic communications in light of an increasingly important role that they play. And those obligations apply irrespective of the medium or device used to communicate, which is a really important distinction to make. Then, 6 months later, June 2017, the SEC conducted a limited sweep exam concerning electronic communications. In this exam, we got our hands on a request letter that was sent around. The SEC was focused not just on policies and procedures around electronic communications, but also indicated that email surveillance is maybe an expectation by the regulator as opposed to best practice. And then in October of 2017, most of us on the line know the new Form ADV amendments took effect. And now the Form ADV actually requires firms to list firm-controlled social media sites, and the content of which should be archived. So I think that all of these, trends seem to say that the regulators are certainly focusing on this area. We'll dive in a little bit deeper into that electronic communications exam request in a little while, but I mostly just want to show that this is something that the regulator is pretty heavily focused on. And we'll also talk about some common deficiencies and some enforcement actions which just further prove kind of the level of scrutiny that the regulators are putting on firm electronic communications. Back in February of 2017, the SEC's Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations, OC, released a risk alert focused on the 5 most frequent compliance topics identified in OC examinations of investment advisors. Number 1 was the compliance rule, which requires that firms adopt written policies and procedures and test them no less frequently than annually. And number 5 is the books and records rule. Now, with respect to number 1, the compliance rule, the alert explicitly stated that examples include advisors that do not perform certain internal reviews of their practices required by their compliance manuals. And we have seen this stated as deficiencies in exams related to the review of electronic communications. As it relates to the books and records, which was number 5 of the most frequent deficiencies identified, The alert actually cites advisors not maintaining all required books and records and then inconsistent record keeping. So we can certainly see how this could be related to electronic communications. For example, if your employees are utilizing text messaging for business purposes and those are required records and they're not being maintained, that's pretty easy to get tripped up in those types of books and records violations. Now, in addition to these topics, inadequate surveillance of electronic communications or lack of procedures in this area could potentially evidence a failure to supervise. In a certain action taken by the SEC against James Goodland and Securus Wealth Management back in September 2015, the SEC complaint has an entire section devoted to quote unquote inadequate email reviews. The firm in question's policies required monthly email monitoring, and flagged communications were escalated to the CCO for review. And basically the CCO wasn't reviewing those flagged communications and wasn't doing monthly email monitoring. The CCO didn't completely fail to do email reviews. I guess he did, he would review a random sampling of 50 or so communications, and he did that 7 or 8 times per year. But the SEC said that that was not enough, that it was, not consistent with the firm's policies and procedures. And also explicitly said that the issue was that he didn't focus on any particular issues or adequately document the reviews. So that's kind of another interesting point, is that we're seeing, and this actually just came up in a recent FINRA action, which I'll talk about in just a second, but it's not just looking at whether or not email reviews are being, or electronic communications reviews are being conducted, but whether or not they're, structured properly. Are they cognizant of the risks of your firm, or are you just doing a random sample based on a percentage? And we'll talk about some tips and tools for how these should be conducted a little bit later, but just interesting to note that that seems to now be something that's coming up consistently with the regulators. Now, the FINRA enforcement. So just recently, a few weeks ago, FINRA fined Raymond James $2 million over emails. Essentially, FINRA found that during a 9-year review period, Raymond James's email system was flawed, allowing emails to evade meaningful review. They said that this created unreasonable risk, and certain misconduct by the firm was essentially undetected as a result of it. What was interesting about this case is that the SEC said that the lexicon that Raymond James was utilizing, so the combination of keywords and phrases, wasn't good enough, essentially. That in light of the firm's size and structure and business model and experience from prior disciplinary actions, that lexicon just simply wasn't enough. And in addition to that, FINRA said that Raymond James didn't have adequate personnel or resources for those that were reviewing those emails. Lastly, just another kind of interesting point about that particular action is that FINRA found that Raymond James didn't periodically test the configuration of that lexicon-based email system, and rather the firm was focused on reducing false positives, which we'll talk a little bit about filtering rules later, but instead of focusing on how to get kind of more substantial communications in the review based on risks and content, the firm was more concerned with, weeding out the junk, so to say. So like I said, I think that both of those, enforcement actions show that just, not only do you need to be doing email reviews, but you need to be thoughtful about them. So that's certainly a departure from what we've seen in the past, especially where a lot of firms in recent history haven't been doing email reviews. It's something that certainly firms should be focusing on. Now, in addition to enforcement that is related specifically to electronic communications policies and procedures and oversight, like in these two examples, electronic communications often lead examiners to other issues at the firm. Examples include, sharing portfolio info with third parties, the misuse of MNPI, and we'll talk about that one in detail a little bit later, problematic political contributions, etc. So in light of all this, it's clear the regulators are focused on not just policies and procedures, but also oversight. Now that is further evidenced by the recent SEC requests targeting electronic communications. Now, for background, we got our hands on a request letter being circulated back in June, which was purportedly sent to a handful of RIAs focused exclusively on advisor use of controls around electronic communications. Now, generally, we've seen such requests, so think about social media sweep and cybersecurity sweeps, utilized by the SEC as essentially fact-finding missions that eventually result in guidance. In light of these requests, we've been encouraging our clients to review, their own compliance programs to ensure that they're able to adequately respond to any such requests and get ahead of any potential future guidance, which we, hope to see in the near future. In the next few slides, I'll talk through the nature of the requests contained in that list and share my thoughts on what implications they may have for your compliance programs. So electronic messaging itself is intended to include any and all forms of written communication conveyed electronically that are subject to Rule 204, 2A7, or 204A11 under the Act. Now, what's important, and this was reiterated in the FINRA 2017 priorities letter, is that it doesn't matter whether these communications are conducted on the firm systems or on third-party applications or platforms, or whether sent on firm or personally owned devices. Meaning if an employee is utilizing their own phone or their own computer to conduct messaging on behalf of your firm, those kind of fall under this umbrella. Explicitly, electronic messaging includes instant messaging and personal or private messaging. So think any of the social networks, Facebook Messenger, LinkedIn Messenger, or any chat services. So, WhatsApp. Also includes instant messaging using third-party equipment like Bloomberg terminals, or instant messaging on third-party platforms like Slack, which has gained in popularity over the last year. Electronic communications also includes text and SMS messaging, so iPhone messages and regular text messages. Now, this can get a little bit tricky, and we'll talk about it a little bit later again, but iPhone iMessages currently can't be archived by any of your typical providers. Apple has the rights to those and basically aren't giving them up. So if your firm is utilizing iPhones and sending text messages for business purposes, there's got to be some solution in place to get around that little hiccup there. And usually that's in the form of either firm issued devices or disabling iMessages. But we can, again, talk about that a little bit later. And then there's email, so personal email and firm email. Now, all of these, three buckets essentially fall into the realm of electronic messaging. But what was really interesting is that the request list that went around explicitly was not intended to include emails sent or received on firm email system and retained by the advisor. So to me, that signals that the SEC is trying to ascertain how advisors are utilizing non-firm email communications for business use. So that kind of reiterates, the fact pattern of the SEC coming in, on this fact-finding mission, trying to determine how its registrants are utilizing these types of, messaging other than the firm email. They've pretty much got their arms around that at this point. And then again, hopefully we'll see some guidance come out of it. But what it really should signal to all of you on the line is you've got to be critically thinking about electronic messaging aside from your firm's email. Before I get into this slide, I'm actually going to toss it over to Chantel to do our second poll of the day.
Okay, for our second poll of the day, we're asking what communications platforms does your firm currently utilize for business purposes? And you can select one: email only, email and instant messaging, email and social media, email and text, and email and 2 other communication mediums. Give everybody a couple more seconds to get the answers in. All right. So it looks like we have 21% said email only, 51% said email and instant messaging, 10% are archiving email and social media, 3% are email and text, and 14% are email plus 2 other communication mediums.
Thanks, Chantal. So that's pretty consistent with what we've been seeing. So it looks like a lot of you are, just email and some kind of IM, whether you're utilizing Bloomberg Messenger or Skype for Business or Slack. Good chunk still email only. A few in the email and social media, and then a few of you who are ahead of the ball there with two or more communication items in addition to email. So just, thinking about that, and then thinking about kind of what I was talking about in the intro, if, these types of electronic communication channels are the way of the future. Those of you that are only archiving email might be headed in a direction where, that's going to expand in the near future. So something to certainly think about. Okay, I'm going to jump into now just talking about the nature of the requests that we saw in this request list that was circulated back in June. Again, this request list was focused on advisor use of non-firm email electronic communications. So the requests, so they kind of fell into these four buckets here: background information, compliance, program record keeping, and security and privacy. So for background information, the requests looked for the advisor to describe and define the business use of electronic messaging. So, what platforms are utilized by your employees to conduct your firm's business. It asked about, what are the permissions and the prohibitions. So, a lot of policies as of now and historically most of the ones that I've seen say something along the lines of, employees are prohibited from utilizing anything other than firm email and, maybe Bloomberg or maybe Skype for business use. And so that was, the SEC was looking to see what those prohibitions are. It also interestingly requested information about if there's any variance between roles. So for instance, if, you have independent contractors, doing work for you and they get a firm email address, or even if they don't, what kind of permissions and prohibitions are built around their use of your firm's, of communications on behalf of your firm, or to the extent, this one I've actually seen before, maybe you allow those in investor relations on behalf of your firm utilize LinkedIn Messenger, but nobody else at your firm can, for the purpose of fundraising or whatever the case may be. So to the extent that there are variances in permissions between varying roles and types of employees, they were looking into that, which I found pretty interesting. And then the types of devices that are utilized in the nature of the communication. So, if your employees are allowed to use personal mobile phones to access email, that's the type of information they were looking for. So what devices are utilized to conduct electronic messaging and what types of communications are on those specific devices. And then moving on to the compliance program, they're looking for written and informal policies concerning electronic communications, looking for processes for ongoing monitoring and review, as well as documentation around those reviews, including exception reports, violations, and any remedial actions taken. So meaning if you conduct electronic communications reviews and you find something problematic, or you are conducting a review of, your third-party archiving provider and you find something problematic, how do you document that, and what remedial action do you take, and what kind of documentation do you have around that? Looking for evidence of compliance reviews. So there's an insinuation there that a review of your electronic communications should be part of your compliance reviews, which if we think back to, those 5 most frequent deficiencies, number 1 was the compliance rule. So there you have it. And then also, risk assessments. Does your risk assessment contemplate risks related to electronic communications? Record keeping, the requests looked for, device and application inventory. So, going back to the background information, you've got to be able to explain what types of devices, the nature of communications, and, maybe is there an inventory for that? What do you utilize for the retention and archival of these communications? Who are your vendors? And do your record keeping related policies and procedures contemplate electronic communications? And then lastly, there were requests focused on security and privacy. So written and informal policies and procedures around sensitive information, for example, non-public personal information in electronic messaging. What kind of precautionary measures are taken in that regard, whether or not there have been any breaches, and if so, what types of remedial actions were taken. So I think that for each of these, 4 areas where these requests were focused, we can take a few things away from it. So I think as it relates to the background information, it's really important for advisors, number one, to determine the use of electronic messaging for business purposes. And I'll give you some, practice tips for how you can do that a little later. And advisors should be conducting an assessment of current policies and procedures. And once that assessment is complete, those policies and procedures should be updated, they should be monitored, and your employees should be trained on them. As it relates to the compliance programs, policies obviously need to address more than firm email. Your policies need to address instant messaging, social media, text messaging, and any other mediums that your employees may be using. The review of messages should be part of your firm's supervisory process. Not just content either. Some of the requests, it was clear that the SEC was looking for evidence that advisors were not just testing the content of the communications, but also whether or not, the archiving and retention was functioning as it should. Annual reviews and risk assessments should include electronic messaging. And documentation is a must. Documentation around your oversight, documentation around exceptions, documentation around violations, and documentation around remedial actions taken. It's better to have those things than to be scrambling for it in the case of an exam. As it relates to record keeping, firms should potentially consider developing an inventory of devices and platforms involving electronic communications, and it should be updated frequently. Ensure electronic messaging is included in any record-keeping policies and procedures. And then also initial and periodic diligence on any third-party vendors to ensure that, your records are being kept as they should. And lastly, as it relates to security and privacy, again, it was clear to us from those requests that advisors should ensure information security policies address controls around electronic messaging. Is there encryption when there needs to be? Your third parties, your archiving, vendors, is their security up to par with SEC standards? And do you do any testing around breaches and improper channels being used? So I think that what's, the biggest takeaway from these requests is that if we look at the review of communications, this is something that, not a lot of firms were doing a few years ago, and, then kind of became this best practice. And now it's an expectation by the regulator, seemingly. So, we would encourage everybody to take a fresh look at your compliance policies and procedures that relate to these types of messaging, and make sure that you work these reviews into your compliance calendar. Moving on from the specific electronic communications exam requests, I now want to transition to typical routine examinations. So electronic communications are frequently included in initial and supplemental requests during SEC examinations. In the next few slides, we'll talk about some typical requests that we've been seeing in routine exams, some considerations when you're, responding to these types of requests, and some helpful practice tips when you are examined. So typical requests. Now, this is not meant to say that this is the only type of, or these are the only types of requests that you may encounter in the case of an examination, but here are just kind of some that we've been seeing. We see a lot, we do see some requests in initial request lists that are sent by the SEC, but we see more, we're finding, in supplemental requests, which kind of signals that, maybe they start requesting more electronic communications when they're, zoning in on a particular issue or concern. So, particular compliance concerns where they may be focused and may be requesting electronic communications around would be, maybe valuation of a particular investment, or particular trades or investments. RAUM calculation or marketing, we often see requests looking for, all communications related to marketing. Maybe they will request communications for particular personnel. So, maybe they will request everything from one of your portfolio managers or from somebody in IR or from, your head trader. Or we also have seen some that are focused on particular clients or investors, like strategic advisors or co-investors or pension plans. And again, these are just illustrative examples. We have seen all of these, but we've seen others too. I just wanted to highlight kind of the main, areas where we've seen electronic communications requests falling into. We're generally not seeing, a request of give me all of your communications from the last 2 years. So usually they're pretty targeted. They're generally requested over a specific time period, generally somewhere around 2 years. Most of the time, they're explicitly requesting email and IM communications or communications on a third-party vendor system, for example, Bloomberg, AOL, Google, Skype. We have seen Outlook calendars included, but again, they're generally limited in scope. Doesn't mean that yours definitely will be, but that is what we've been seeing. Okay, so responding to electronic messaging requests. So the first thing when you get an electronic communications request as part of your initial or supplemental request is to extract the relevant communications per the request. Now, a lot of the archiving platforms now have custom filtering. We would encourage you to utilize it. It can make your life a lot easier. Not only when you're doing your, regular electronic communications reviews, but also in the case of an examination. So you can utilize, the keywords and the key phrases, or you can, specify which employees you want to look at to really narrow down what you're looking at and what the SEC is requesting. So utilize specific criteria in your platform when you're pulling the communications in response to a request. And it's very important that all forms of electronic messaging utilized for business use are captured. So this is where, again, we're going to want to get back to, what we were talking about before, which is you need to make sure that you know what your employees are using before the SEC comes to the door. Because then, maybe you're going to be scrambling to get the request together and you might not have all of the appropriate channels archived. The next step would be to create a privileged communications log. You're going to want to review any of your responses so that you're providing to the SEC for responsiveness, obviously, but also for privilege. Any communications that you do withhold on the basis of privilege need to be identified in a privilege log, and that has to be produced to examiners. So we would encourage you to consider developing standards for identifying privilege on a real-time basis. It can help you when it comes time to produce these documents. There's a few ways to do that. One way is to develop standards for labeling, privileged communications, in the subject line or something of that, nature. Or a lot of the platforms these days also have rules that you can set up. So, a privilege rule, for example. So you can actually go into your archiving system, and to the extent it has the functionality, and set up a rule so that any communications, from your, external or internal counsel sent to or from your internal or external counsel are automatically grouped together or tagged as privileged. And then what you can do is when it comes time to run that export for your exam, you can, run the privilege first, and then you can sort through that. You're still going to want to review it so that you can create your log, but it can save you a lot of headaches and a lot of wasted time if you've got something to help you in this regard on a real-time basis before you're examined. And lastly, something else you'll want to think about is you're going to want to coordinate FOIA requests and bait stamping. So you'll want to consider requesting confidential treatment of the materials that you produce in response to an SEC examination request. When you think about electronic communications, we get the question a lot, well, how do we produce those, and have them bait stamped? Oftentimes in request letters themselves, communications will be requested explicitly in .pst format, which is an Outlook data file native format. Bait stamping providers generally can, convert your electronic communications that are provided into PDF and have them bait stamped. And what we see a lot of clients doing is just uploading both the native .pst, export, as well as the bait stamped PDF documents that follow. And when there are attachments, providers generally can convert each communication into a PDF with attachments either following or combined as a single PDF. But you're going to want to make sure that you consider that and get in touch with the bait stamping provider sooner rather than later, just because that can take some time. So helpful practice tips when it comes to responding to examination requests. Consider reaching out to the staff to request to limit the scope of an atypically burdensome request. We see this a lot. Maybe the SEC requests all marketing communications for the last, 3 years, and you realize that that is an export of, hundreds of thousands of emails or whatever the case may be. It's not abnormal to go back to them and say, listen, here's what you asked for. Here's what this response is going to look like. Can you limit the scope of this a little bit? And oftentimes they do. And sometimes that, saves both you and the examiners a headache. So we would encourage you to, communicate with them to the extent that there is something that is, again, atypically burdensome. As I mentioned before, coordinate with a bait stamping provider as soon as practical upon receiving a request to ensure documents are provided within applicable deadlines. You can often, time gets lost at the beginning of these requests, trying to scramble everything together and get your response and review your responses for appropriateness and everything. The last thing you want is to be held up because of a bait stamping time issue. Consider proactively reviewing emails in preparation for an examination. It's always better to be ahead of a potential issue. Train your employees on the proper use of electronic communications. One thing that we typically advise in training is, employees should limit, the personal use of electronic communications. It can just unnecessarily open your firm up to further scrutiny. You don't want employees, if the regulator sees a lot of traffic between, an employee's firm email and their personal email address, that can create questions. And then lastly, test platforms utilized to retain communications to ensure they're functioning. It happens. It's technology glitches. There can be issues. I would encourage you to be sure that on some kind of, periodic basis, whether it be quarterly or monthly, you go in and you or you in conjunction with your IT team or whatever the case may be, test those systems, make sure that there's no gaps, run an export for a particular time period on a periodic basis and compare it against some internal metric of how many communications are on your servers, for example. Make sure that there aren't any gaps or holes in the retention of your electronic communications. Okay. Developing policies and procedures. So of course, being truly examination ready requires having adequate policies and procedures. So how do you know what's appropriate for your firm? First, you'll need to assess and then develop and finally implement and test. So assessing your firm's position, this is obviously going to be the first step here. You're going to want to update and review your risk assessment. Examine your risk assessment from an electronics communication standpoint. Look at any potential record-keeping risks, any content-related risks, information security risks, and then any third-party vendor risks. And then, really important, determine the employee use of electronic messaging. One way to do this is through questionnaires and attestations. And we're seeing a lot of these now. We set them up through Cordium's compliance software. Whatever software you're utilizing, you can set up these questionnaires and you can ask your employees what communication platforms are you utilizing to conduct business on behalf of our firm. And that goes a long way to showing that you're thinking about it. At the end of the day, you all have to rely to a certain point on the integrity of your employees, which is the same, same thing for personal trading or, political contributions or any of those. But that can go a long way to helping you get your arms around, your firm's electronic messaging usage. And then test it. Do your employees have social media handles in their signature blocks? You know, if they've got a social media handle and a signature block for their firm email, you know, it wouldn't be hard to draw the line to say, well, maybe they're utilizing this social media for business purposes. Are social media messages auto-forwarded to firm email accounts? So a lot of times, you know, LinkedIn, if somebody has their firm email set up as their LinkedIn contact, you know, their LinkedIn messaging will actually be copied to their firm email, which allows, you know, the compliance officers or whoever's conducting these electronic communications reviews to see, you know, what kind of traffic is on that social media site. Utilize keywords and phrases. So when we're doing electronic communications reviews, use the key phrases like GChat or text me, WhatsApp, message me, DM, direct message, on Slack, take it offline, etc. If you look for these types of key phrases, that type of lexicon will actually help you to identify cases where maybe there's an exception to your policy or employees are utilizing some type of, you know, communication medium that isn't approved by your firm. We're going to do our last poll here. I'm going to have Chantel take over for this last poll.
Okay, for our last poll, we're asking, does your firm currently conduct testing around public company meetings and calls? It's yes, ongoing, yes, monthly, yes, quarterly, yes, annually, or no. And we'll give everybody a couple seconds to get their responses in. All right, we're going to go ahead and close the poll. And here are the answers. We have 15% said yes, ongoing, 4% said yes, monthly, 3% said yes, quarterly, 14% said yes, annually, and 64% said no.
Thanks, Chantel. So wow, that's a pretty big group that are not currently conducting the reviews. So that's certainly something that you'll want to start thinking about in light of, you know, the scrutiny around this area. And for those of you that are doing it on an ongoing basis, that's awesome. You know, being responsive and reactive on a real-time basis is obviously, you know, a good place to be. Okay. Developing appropriate policies and procedures. I'm going to start to move a little bit quickly as I see we're starting to run out of time here, but you know, things that you want to think about when you're developing your policies and procedures. Prohibitions and permissions. Think about that request that was talking about variance among roles. You know, who is allowed to use what. Also, social media. You know, we could do a whole separate webinar on social media considerations. You know, content. You might want to have rules around content, for example, allowing employees to accept or give endorsements or recommendations. If they're being utilized for business purposes, you want to ensure that they're archived. You know, consider CCO approval for public posts concerning the advisory business. Make sure that, you know, any firm-controlled sites are listed on your ADV, but that's something you'll want to consider. Mobile devices, you know, are you going to have them bring your own device, a BYOD policy or firm issued? When your employees are utilizing text messages for business purposes, it can get a little complicated with BYOD because, like I said, you know, a lot of people have iPhones these days. These iMessages can't get archived. So you'll need to consider all of that when you're determining what type of mobile device policy you want to have. Oversight and monitoring. How often will you be, you know, reviewing electronic communications and who is responsible? What kind of diligence are you doing on your third parties? How often are you conducting employee training? Do you have any initial or annual forms, questionnaires, or attestations? And what kind of information security and privacy policies do you have concerning electronic communications? As far as implementing an adequate oversight process, you know, there's a lot of benefits to conducting reviews. The majority of flags that we find when we do communications reviews are generally related to, you know, general compliance concerns. It's really not a training opportunity more than anything. So a lot of times we find instances of employees forwarding emails to a personal email, and most of the time there's no malintent. But what it does is it serves as an opportunity for somebody in compliance to go out to that employee and say, hey, by the way, we're conducting this review. We see that you did this. You shouldn't be doing it. And overall, over time, with each and every review and each and every flag, that culture of compliance only grows. It helps to prepare for an examination, and it's an excellent tool for monitoring firm risks. When you're conducting the reviews, be thoughtful about your search methodology. We saw those 2 enforcement cases where, the methodology just simply wasn't good enough. Consider utilizing the rules built into your archiving system, and make sure that you're documenting any reviews appropriately, including any remedial action taken. Ensure that you're keeping your records, in compliance with the books and records rule. And again, make sure that you've got IT, considerations handled. So you should be reaching out to your third parties that are handling these electronic communications for you on a periodic basis to ensure that, their own security, processes are up to par with your SEC requirements. Okay, so a special focus on electronic communications reviews and MNPI. So there's been a few instances, where there are issues related to MNPI and electronic communications in the news. Recently, August 2017, Deerfield agreed to pay a fine of $4.6 million to settle claims related to insider trading brought by the SEC in May. SEC alleged that several communications were sent from a paid research firm to Deerfield management contained MNPI. There were 3 communications. The complaint states that nevertheless, these emails did not result in any actions by Deerfield to prevent the misuse of MNPI. And the SEC alleged that certain of those communications may have resulted in trading by Deerfield. Visium. Most are probably familiar with the Visium case. Sanjay Bhavani, PM of Visium's healthcare fund, was accused of committing securities and wire fraud. Essentially, there was confidential information obtained from the FDA or an official or an ex-official of the FDA about the agency's approval of pending drug applications. The SEC explicitly describes emails, and those emails were utilized to bring the charges. And then kind of an older one, but one I like to reference nonetheless. Back in 2010, the SEC alleged that Igor Podoroba, a high-ranking investment banker in UBS Securities Global Healthcare Group, tipped his friend with MNPI about impending transactions involving pharmaceutical companies. Among the means of communication used to illegally tip and trade on the info were coded email messages that referred to securities and money as frequent flyer miles and potatoes. And coded an email exchange as a discussion about Macy's wedding registry. So in addition to the plethora of insider trading cases which utilize electronic communications to bring charges, we've also seen heightened scrutiny by the regulators around MNPI controls during examinations. In recent deficiency letters, we've seen multiple instances of the SEC claiming advisors don't have adequate controls in place to prevent the misuse of MNPI. It's often been centered specifically around corporate access, so meetings and calls with public company executives. SEC has stated in public forums that advisors shouldn't rely on the executive's own, duties to protect MNPI under Reg FD. And in order to avoid this becoming an issue when your firm is examined, we highly recommend implementing testing into your compliance supervisory procedures around MNPI. We've seen rather in deficiency letters that the SEC is expecting CCOs to be aware of public company meetings and calls, and that those, that essentially that log of meetings and calls should drive your testing around MNPI. If for those of you that are in hedge funds, you should be reviewing your trade blotter in light of those public company meetings and calls. And then, we recommend kind of the trifecta of testing to the extent you've got instances where you've got an overlap between those public company meetings and calls and trades, which is often, pretty often, you should be doing some sort of review around the emails, related to that particular investment, potentially also around the research notes related to that particular investment, and then of your employees' personal trading. We're seeing in deficiencies, again, that just simply doing testing of your winners may not be enough. In addition, if you're utilizing expert networks, the SEC is expecting, chaperones, not in expert networks, and also potentially these one-on-one meetings and calls. So the bottom line is this is something that we have seen time and time again in the last year or so being, brought up and scrutinized heavy by the SEC. So for those of you that, have public trading strategies, something that we encourage you to really critically think about and look at. So practice tips, again, simply testing winners might not be enough. SEC is expecting the firm to have a record of direct corporate access that should drive testing and oversight procedures. You should keep detailed records of testing you conduct, and it is really important to train employees on the identification of MNPI. And then to wrap it up here, just so that we can leave a few minutes for questions, we'll talk about some, practice tips for conducting electronic messaging reviews and some thoughts looking ahead. When you're conducting electronic messaging reviews, be thoughtful in your search methodology. Again, I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but make sure that, any lexicon that you're using is appropriate. What we generally do and what we definitely encourage is, differentiate the searches that you're doing. So don't just do a random sample based on a lexicon. Think about your firm's risks. If you have a public trading strategy, maybe a quarter of your reviews you do, focused on, trading. And then, if you're fundraising, maybe you focus a portion of your reviews on outgoing communications from those in your investor relations department, in addition to maybe doing a random sampling using a lexicon. So differentiate the reviews that you're doing. Utilize filtering rules if they're available. Weed out any junk emails, blasts. You can set it up so that when you're conducting a review, you don't see emails from @wallstreetjournal.com or @amazon.com, and it can help save you time and make your reviews more substantive. Ensure your archiving provider's retention standards are SEC compliant. Not all of them are. So make sure that when you're thinking about providers, you make sure that they are SEC compliant from a retention standpoint. And another just piece of advice when you're looking for an archiving provider or reviewing your own archiving provider, looking forward, we're seeing this trend towards more and more types of electronic communications. You don't want to be stuck with a provider that can only archive firm emails, for example. You need to think of, you don't want any silos. You don't want to have one provider for one, another provider for another. So be thoughtful in selecting your archiving providers as well. And if electronic reviews become administratively burdensome, consider outsourcing them. And then lastly, looking ahead, prohibitory policies might be a thing of the past. So, a big chunk of you are only archiving emails still, and it might be that just prohibitions on everything else is not effective. So we would encourage you to take a look at that. We'll cross our fingers for future guidance that would mimic the fact pattern of the social media sweep exams conducted in 2011. If we're right, then these requests were a fact-finding mission, and maybe we'll see some guidance come out in the future about how advisors should be handling these non-firm email communications. Be mindful that there is increased scrutiny during, that's a typo, sorry, routine examinations. And think again critically about your mobile device policies in light of the trend towards the use of more electronic communications, which I just mentioned. With that, I will open it up to questions. I know we've got about 5 minutes left here, but Chantel, if you've seen anything come in.
Sure, Molly. We have a couple questions come in. I'm just going to ask a couple as we do have a time crunch here. But the first one that came in was, what does the SEC expect to see in terms of documentation of ongoing reviews?
So I think that for documentation, it's really important. One question that we get a lot is, is running an audit trail out of, my archiving provider sufficient? And while it may, it might work, we would generally encourage you to go a little bit further, get credit for what you're doing. My recommendation would be to have some kind of, master log where you say, what you're reviewing, what dates you're reviewing, and then, what you found. And then that way you can kind of hit all of the requests in one spot. So, to the extent you get one of these request letters, you'll be able to produce documentation around your oversight, including any remedial action, what kinds of lexicons you're using, et cetera, all in one place. So really, more than anything, to make your life easier, I would suggest creating some kind of, spreadsheet or utilizing something of the sort beyond just an audit trail.
Okay, great. And has the SEC put out any guidance on how often they expect CCOs to review firm emails?
Unfortunately, there hasn't been any guidance formally on that yet. A little bit different from FINRA in that, the SEC has not yet made it an absolute requirement. I would hope that we get some clarity on that, if and when guidance does come out. Generally, we would recommend no less frequently than quarterly for conducting electronic communications reviews. And even then, the more often you do it, the more able you are to respond to a potential issue in real time. So, in our view, kind of the more often the better, but there hasn't been any official word on it from the regulator.
Awesome.
Okay. So that wraps up the webinar today. I thank everybody for joining us. If anybody has any further questions or we didn't get to a question today, please feel free to send me an email and we'd be happy to talk more about it. So thank you very much, everybody.